Welcome, everyone. Is this on here? We are working. My name is Andrew Crislip, and welcome to the Blake Lecture. This is the William E. and Miriam S. Blake Lecture in the History of Christianity. And as I already mentioned, I'm Andrew Crislip, and I'm a professor here in the Department of History at VCU, and I hold the Blake Chair in the History of Christianity. This is the 27th installment of the series, and it's the first time that we've live streamed the lecture and the first time that I've done this as well. So I thank you for joining us for this evening and for your participations and patience in tonight's proceedings. We have several parts to, so let me say first a few words about the lecture series. The series was endowed by Professor Blake's students, friends, and family in the early 1990s to celebrate Dr. Blake's decades of teaching the history of Christianity at VCU, and even before that at Richmond Professional Institute. Over the series' past 3 decades, VCU has hosted experts throughout the areas of the history of Christianity. It's been an enormous pleasure over my years at VCU to have become friends with Dr. and Mrs. Blake and their family, and it's been a special honor to work with Dr. Blake, who has continued to teach at VCU, at Westminster Canterbury, and at the Shepherd Center of Richmond's Open University, which I have also taught at. The Blakes truly model the community engagement that VCU cherishes. Alongside the department's other series, such as the Greer Lectures, the Society of the Cincinnati Lectures, and the Alexandrian Society Lectures, and the Blake Speakers Series, the Blake Lecture are an important part of the life of the department and a thread of remembrance and celebration of the intellectual life and public engagement so central to the Department of History. So I wish to welcome the Blake family tonight and thank them and the other extremely generous donors and supporters who've made this series possible and have endowed the study of the history of Christianity at VCU for the future. I also want to announce very quickly that next year's lecture will be given by Professor Sylvester Johnson of Virginia Tech. Dr. Johnson's lecture on the borderlines of religion, theology, and artificial intelligence was canceled in the early days of pandemic in 2020, but we've rescheduled that. So now I'm going to start the lecture portion. I want to take a few minutes to introduce this year's distinguished lecturer, Dr. Susan Holman. Dr. Holman is the John R. Eckrich Chair and Professor of Religion and the Healing Arts at Valparaiso University in Valparaiso, Indiana. She received the Ph.D. from Brown University and a Master in Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School, as well as a Master of Science from Tufts University, Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. She's written 4 books and edited 3 others, along with her essays and articles. I first became acquainted with Dr. Holman's work when I was writing my dissertation over 20 years ago, and her first book came out, The Hungry Are Dying, Beggars and Bishops in Roman Cappadocia. Since then, she has edited volumes on wealth and poverty in early Christianity, the life and theology of Gregory the Great, or Basil the Great, sorry, and recently a volume on the body in early Christian thought and practice, the garb of being, embodiment and the pursuit of holiness in late ancient Christianity with Fordham University Press. In 2009, she published God Knows There's Need, Christian Responses to Poverty, and in 2015, Beholden, Religion, Global Health, and Human Rights, both with Oxford University Press. For the latter, Dr. Holman won the prestigious 2016 Grawemeyer Award in Religion from the University of Louisville. Dr. Holman's current work continues to explore the connections between history, theology, public health, and environmental healing. So it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight Professor Holman to deliver the 2021 Blake Lecture in the History of Christianity.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I do wish I could be experiencing Virginia in the springtime, but it's a real honor to be here with you. And I want to begin by thanking Professor Crislip for his inspiring work on ancient healthcare and hospitals, and also Andrea White and Tyler Conrad and the others on the team who have made this event possible. I begin with 3 stories. Story 1. Early in the 7th century, a book known as The Spiritual Meadow opens with a monk who determined to set out on what we would call high-risk international travel. Against advice, he leaves his monastery to walk 200 miles from Jerusalem to Sinai. But just down the road, he falls ill, collapsing in a nearby cave. Next morning, feverish and dream-haunted, he tries again, but is still too sick. Lying prone in this cave, he has a vision of John the Baptist who promises healing if he stays put. Jesus used to visit me in this cave, John says. It's even more holy than Sinai. Talked into what is essentially lifetime lockdown in his own backyard, the monk is healed. In our year of pandemic quarantines, we may sympathize with this monk's itch to leave home, his frustration at delay, maybe even his experience of illness. But it's an odd story to begin what is in fact a travelogue of wanderings across the ancient Mediterranean world by the monk John Moschus and his learned disciple Sophronius, imaged here. All too soon, the whole Near East will be a dangerous place, as Persian armies stampede and slaughter in Syria, Jerusalem, and the area around John and Sophronius's monastery in the Judean desert. By the early 600s, the two are traveling west across Egypt, their physical and emotional luggage, including illness, books, theological pressures, and eventually John's dead body. Story 2. 80 years later, in early Anglo-Saxon Britain, and I'll use the word Britain and England interchangeably here, recognizing historical differences, a monastic priest writes to the Bishop of Winchester and begging him, pour out your prayers for me to O Peregrino, which one scholar translates, your foreign visitor. The writer is Theodore, Archbishop of Canterbury, who came to England after a long journey from his home in the city of Tarsus. Theodore's identification as a Peregrino may be diplomatic rhetoric, since now in his 80s, he's been the Pope's representative to the English Church for nearly 20 years. Like Sophronius, he too fled Persians, is fluent in several languages, and in addition learned a fair amount of medicine. He settled in Rome in a community of Greek-speaking monks, long enough to witness a theological conflict that cost the life of at least one pope, as well as Sophronius's famous disciple, Maximus the Confessor, whom Theodore may have known. In Rome, he lived quietly until a young abbot from North Africa named Hadrian introduced him to the Pope after plague had wiped out a group of Anglo-Saxon priests who'd come to Rome for their new archbishop's consecration. Perhaps among those victims was one desperate Eadbald, whose name survives today in graffiti scratched on a fresco of Luke the physician in the catacombs of Comodilla. Okay, says the Pope, as Bede tells the story, I'll make Theodore Archbishop as long as you, Hadrian, go with him to bring light theological order and education to Britain. While they escaped the plague, praise God, the journey across the Alps to England took a full year, with Hadrian detained in Gaul as a spy. Theodore lay sick on the continent that last long winter, but when he finally came to Canterbury, he was welcomed with kindness, even reverence. On Easter Sunday, 685, Theodore would preside at York over the consecration of a hermit bishop of Lindisfarne named Cuthbert. Story 3. 2 years later, in March of 687, Cuthbert prays alone as he prepares to die on his tiny rocky island 9 miles off the coast of Lindisfarne. If we assume it was the real Cuthbert whose bones were examined at Durham Cathedral in 1899, This man in prayer was still muscularly very strong, with perfect teeth, but the bones hint he was also in pain from two fused vertebrae, back and shoulder erosion, necrosis, and ulcers that the 1899 physicians read as, quote, tubercular mischief. Thus, awaiting mortality as a monk fixed in place, watching the seabirds and the rotation of sun and stars, Cuthbert has no idea that his body will, in death, endure the physical trauma of the refugee. First shipped back to Lindisfarne and buried with honor in the church, his body, long salted by the sea that he loved, probably mummified naturally in its encased wax cloth, carved oak coffin and sandy soil. He will be first exhumed 10 years later, his still pliable limbs pronounced miraculously incorrupt. After the Vikings destroy Lindisfarne, the community will, in the spring of 875, pack him up with all their other relics in a new hidebound box and bear it on their shoulders over hundreds of miles, settling eventually in Durham. They're giving him a new cathedral as his home. Yet there, for 1,000 years, from the late 9th to the turn of the 20th century, his body will, like that of many refugees today, continue to endure trauma of permanent damage by security officials, kings, priests, pilgrims, curiosity seekers, and hired grave diggers. In no less than 6 official investigations, his body will be repeatedly handled, dressed, and undressed, silk wraps torn to shreds, coffin axed, bones dropped, gossiped over, photographed, and sketched. Reduced to disarticulated skin-coated bones, he's finally reinterred in 1899 with proper reverence. Cuthbert's forced migration may have ended in Durham Cathedral, but his traumatic injuries continued for centuries. He who welcomed ordinary physicians as Lindisfarne monks will be literally torn apart for his supposed supernatural power to resist decay. These 3 stories from late antique Christian history offer models of refugees whose lives illustrate ways that illness, theology, medicine, and the social dynamics of displacement connects across time. In this paper, I will use these stories to suggest 3 varieties of ancient healthcare attitudes through the metaphor of the palimpsest. But before turning to palimpsests, let's first consider the simple bodily effects of disruptive relocation for any refugee, even monks. Specifically, what are the risks of travel when it's a consequence of forced migration that starts, as many are doing today, with political unrest, persecution, and violence? We see here a basic summary designed to aid relief workers helping the many boat refugees in 2016. And in 2018, The Lancet published a commission report on migration and health that summarized key issues more broadly. The report highlighted, quote, the diversity, dynamics, and benefits, unquote, of migration, including the risks and benefits for groups as well as effects on individual health. Refugees and migrants fleeing violence, the commission reported, face health risks that can include further violence, mental illness, depression, as well as the consequences of care gaps caused by traumatic stress, discrimination, and absence or denial of health and social services en route and across borders. Yet migrants also bring with them valuable skills, cultural gifts, and energies that, in economic terms, quote, generally contribute more to the wealth of host societies than they cost, unquote. Communities' supports play a vital role in social success and health. These supports can include the community of fellow travelers, as well as those who meet and welcome or not their attempts to cross geographic, political, and linguistic borders. Today, the term refugee has particular legal meaning, someone forced into cross-border displacement who can't go home safely due to violence or persecution. Those who can prove such risks may gain protection under the UN High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, thanks to legal conventions and protocols established since World War II. Terms like refugee and asylum seeker rest today on particular understandings of citizenship, law, nation, and human rights obligations that don't neatly transfer onto the ancient world. Related terms like migrant or foreigner are more generic descriptors that don't necessarily align with protective regulations, past or present. In calling these monks refugees, I do mean they were forced to flee against their will due to life-threatening violence. But they were also well-recognized monastic leaders and powerful bishops. Thus, the risks they, or at least two of them while alive, faced in relocation were mitigated by their privileged status, their education, their male gender, and strongly supportive communities, both in transit and at their destinations. The way they're identified in these texts focuses more on religious diplomacy than political or civic citizenship. Yet despite such obvious privilege, the traces of illness, physical trauma, and medical practices in their stories are logical consequences pertinent to wellness across cultures and times. They mark effects that any human body might suffer in forced travel, unfamiliar lands and languages, all weather, enduring for months or years. In these medical narratives, tracings, however, we can also see certain differences in how each of them connected health beliefs and practices common to late antiquity and Christian history. To illustrate these differences, I now turn to the palimpsest. A palimpsest, as Thomas de Quincey put it in 1845, is a membrane or roll cleansed of its manuscript by reiterated successions. This erasure, he added, expelled the writing sufficiently to leave a field for the new manuscript, and yet not sufficiently to make traces of the elder manuscript irrecoverable. De Quincey and literary scholars since him often use palimpsests as a metaphor for hidden ideas and influences in a text, how we read beyond or behind it, or how its message persists with implicit power. In what follows, I too illustrate palimpsests for the purpose of metaphor, but my metaphors are tied to three very specific manuscripts. I do this because real or ink-stained vellum palimpsests tend to contain and often combine texts that directly relate to our topics, medicine and theology in antiquity. These vellum palimpsests can help us think symbolically about connections in the lives of our monks. But as narrative skins, they're also standalone bodies that evidence intersecting practices. Here we see three palimpsests. The first is that discovered by the twin sisters Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Gibson at the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai in the 1890s. Its undertext was the oldest known version of the four Gospels in Syriac, written on these pages in the 4th or 5th century. In 778, John the Stylite, somewhere near Antioch, erased the undertext to reuse the materials. The Gospel was missing 17 leaves, and most folks were then reading a later Syriac version, which may explain his choice to recycle. He used the clean parchment to write a collection of racy popular stories about 16 holy women. He did this, he says, for spiritual profit to his fellow monks and neighbors and for the love of Christ. The sisters and their fellow 19th century Cambridge scholars transcribed and published both of these treasured texts. So in this first example, the theological undertext is scripture. John's construction of the book for his hagiographies preserved the page sequences mostly, though Lewis notes that certain gospel pages got shuffled around a bit. The second model for metaphor is a text known as Arabic NF8. This is part of the Sinai Palimpsest Project, a modern digital documentation of palimpsests, again at St. Catherine's. Seen here via multispectral technology, this particular page's undertext is a striking 5th or 6th century botanical drawing of a medicinal plant. In this manuscript, it's the top or the more recent text that is scripture, in this case, the oldest known gospel in Arabic dated to the 9th century. But the story of this book's undertext points to construction radically different from Lewis's unified, slightly shuffled gospels. To get the pages needed to write this Arabic gospel, the scribe used 128 erased leaves from at least 23 different sources. These have been identified as a bit of, as written in four different languages and include the list seen here: one sales deed, a liturgical text, an ancient book catalog, a list of clothes and objects, 8 different biblical texts, an illustrated story, 2 sermons by Basil of Caesarea, and 35 apparently random sheets from at least 6 different medical texts. Such variety shows us what people were reading, and also that medicine and religion were the most common books at hand. The project's scholarly director, Claudia Rapp, suggests that such medley may also point to an organized production, perhaps even commercial circulation of recycled parchment sheets. The third model for metaphor is a text known as the Syriac Galen Palimpsests, SGP. First written in the 9th century, this text also traveled about at St. Catherine's for maybe 500 years. Around the time the Arabic NF8 scribe was scraping off Greek medicine, this scribe in Edessa or northern Mesopotamia took clean parchment to copy a 6th century Syriac translation of Galen's 2nd century Greek treatise on the mixture and power of simple drugs. We know the Christian doctor Sergius of Rashana, who first translated this, as he did much of Galen in the 6th century, into Syriac. 200 years later, in a monastery near Antioch, another Syriac scribe erased the Galen to reuse the sheets to write a liturgical book, the Parakletike, a collection of canons for ordinary days from Monday to Saturday. Wax-stained pages confirm its actual use in worship. In other words, this book would have been frequently carried, handled, and read almost daily. We don't know if the monks knew or cared that they were going into church with Galen, preserving a non-Christian medical treatise by an opinionated clinician who worshipped the Greek god Asclepius. And its handling continued. Someone by the 13th century gave the liturgical book to St. Catherine's. By the 16th century, most Sinai monks spoke Greek, so it likely got put somewhere in the library and maybe forgotten when the monks built a new building in 1734. A fire in 1975 revealed a hidden room, and one folio of the SGP turned up. But the book is not in an 1893 inventory, which suggests it left Sinai long before, in the light fingers or maybe the pockets of some unknown scholar collector. It was then sold in Leipzig in 1922, sat in the Zurich Library until 1942, was auctioned in New York in 1948, Los Angeles in 2001, and is now owned privately by someone the New York Times calls only a wealthy collector of rare scientific material in Baltimore. Syriac scholar Grigory Kessel miraculously tracked down 6 of the missing 7 leaves, and thanks to the current owner, the whole SGP is now digitally visible online. While this Galen text is not wholly intact, the scribe did overwrite it without shuffling pages. Thus, scholars can read, and are now editing for translation, a priceless medical voice on the healing power of simple substances from the natural world. I've spelled out the differences between these 3 as a background to show how each pattern can be a useful metaphor for religion-health connections in the lives of our 3 refugee monks. To them, we now return. Sophronius's medical views suggest the pattern of the first palimpsest, that is, a scriptural foundation overwritten with popular hagiography. The enduring core of Sophronius's thinking was his theological identity as a Chalcedonian, Christian claims of right doctrine motivating all that he did and said. His travels took him and Moschus to Antioch, Alexandria, and North Africa, and beyond. His luggage included what his disciple Maximus described in a letter of 643 as a, quote, rich abundance of divine books. As many of you can relate, traveling with a library is no easy task. Thinking back to the importance of community in refugee health, Avril Cameron reminds us that, quote, not all North African refugees at this time were poor and low class. It's possible that Sophronius was head of a community of Palestinian monks in Africa, unquote. This group with which Maximus identified and called foreign monks seems to have been accepted immediately and welcomed. Sophronius and Moschus eventually reach Rome, where Moschus died, and Sophronius then trekked back to Jerusalem with his teacher's body. He died in 639 as the Bishop of Jerusalem, who surrendered the city to the invading caliph. He left a number of theological works. My focus here is on his most medical text, a popular hagiography called The Miracles of St. Cyrus and John. This describes a Christian incubation healing shrine at Manuthis near Alexandria, mapped here with 2 8th century frescoes of St. Cyrus. Like the women's hagiography of Sinai, this text also contains a series of short, vivid stories about ordinary people in crisis whose encounters with holy healing inspire and edify. Sophronius's saints heal in strict alliance with correct Chalcedonian evangelism. The text also represents one of the variants common in how some Christians thought about medicine, its total rejection of human doctors. Sophronius actually delights in the humiliation of physicians who are forced, in his stories, to seek the saints because they can't heal even themselves. He has this attitude because he has tried them. His final miracle tells of his own story of an eye disease. Sophronius's pain and vision loss began, he says, when he arrived in Egypt. Egypt was famous for its outstanding medical traditions, and the 6th and 7th centuries were a heyday for Christian medical education. Sophronius first turned, he said, to, quote, the best doctors, and especially those said to have superiority over others by their eloquence and habit, unquote. They examined his eyes frequently and under the open sun, and first blamed his condition on travel, the foreign climate, so another effect of travel, and resulting bodily imbalance. But when their treatment failed and he got worse, they pronounced him incurable. Desperate, he cries out, "Doctors are useless," as the great Isaiah prophesied. Hearing about the saints, he and Moschus then seek out the shrine. The saints instantly agree with him and dismiss, quote, the stupid opinions of the doctors, and they offer him the health that the human physicians could not provide. Sophronius is healed through a series of dreams, affirmed faith, and the use of wax from the oil lamp by the saint's tomb. Thus, I suggest his approach to medicine and health is a metaphorical palimpsest of popular piety, expressed in praise from miracle healers and saints, written over his firmly foundational adherence to Christian scriptures. The palimpsest metaphor for our second monk, Theodore of Tarsus, is, like Arabic NF8, more complicated. On this, you recall, the gospel is the top immediately visible text. And indeed, Theodore's public identity is consistently aligned with translating scripture into life. He teaches, preaches, and cares about theology. He called and led church councils. He advised political rulers across Britain on proper Christian practice and church administration. And he wrote canons and letters to tell the faithful what they should and should not do. He was an uncontroversial, much revered voice for the gospel. He and Hadrian were also very learned, and Phil Booth has suggested that he seems to have known Sophronius and Maximus Confessor. But Theodore did not share Sophronius's scorn for doctors. At the undertext of Theodore's life, we find an extraordinary intersection of references to ordinary stuff, learning, travel experiences, and views about medicine and health. Thanks to recent scholarship, we can identify Theodore and Hadrian as authors of particular Canterbury texts. These include a series of biblical commentaries and a chronicle called the Laterculus Malalianus. The commentaries preserve quotations from a wide range of unusual Greek patristic authors with a strong focus on ancient medicine. The medical comments in them refer, for instance, to types of leprosy, fevers, menstruation, plant medicine, blood circulation, and the effect of the moon's waxing and waning on the size of the brain as an explanation of lunacy. Scholar Michael Lapidge, who's done a lot of work on these texts, confirms Theodore's training in Byzantine medicine. Theodore says he spent time in Constantinople and Lapich suggests that he attended medical lectures of Stephen or Stephanus of Alexandria. Heraclius had brought Stephen to the capital in 610, and he remained there until his death in 635. Stephen's teaching combined philosophy with rhetoric, astronomy, astrology, alchemy, and medicine. His lecture notes on the medical curriculum texts of Hippocrates and Galen that were used to teach medicine at that time survive today and are in translation. Theodore's Laterculus Malalianus expands on an earlier chronicle by someone else, but the portions that are original to Theodore show similar medical influence. There, for example, he speaks of Christ as physician, Christus medicus, an image dear to Ephraim, but not so common in the West. Chapter 12 is an excursus on the science of conception and embryology, interpreted through a strange reading of numerology in texts on Solomon's temple. Sebastian Brock thinks it unlikely Theodore read Syriac, but notes that, quote, he must have been very well aware of Syriac exegetical tradition, unquote, given the parallels between the commentaries and Syriac exegesis. He grew up at the edge of Syria just a few years after Sergius of Rashana's prolific medical translations of Galen. The stories also hint that Theodore consulted with doctors and expected his clergy to do the same. For instance, Bede cites John of Beverley, Bishop of Hexham, once a monk at Hilda's monastery in Whitby, as saying, quote, I remember how Archbishop Theodore used to say it was very dangerous to bleed a patient when the moon is waxing and the ocean tide flowing, unquote. Thus, like Palimpsest Arabic NF8, Theodore's life reflects his underlying knowledge, use, and acceptance of many different medical sources and therapies. While we know nothing of Hadrian's medical training, it's likely that he too directed teaching in the Canterbury school with a focus on similar knowledge and skill. Finally, Cuthbert. As you will guess, I suggest the Syriac Galen palimpsest as the tangible metaphor for Cuthbert's model of health religious connections. The SGP, you recall, contains a reasonably unified medical undertext that took its external form in a liturgical order used for daily prayer and worship. Like the Galen text on simple medicines, all about the power of single natural substances for health, the pervasive underscript of Cuthbert's lives, living and dead, centered on his harmony with and his power over the natural world, animals, winds, water, weather, with occasional healing miracles illustrated here. Like the medieval monks who, if unwittingly, practiced liturgy by bringing Galen's medicine to church, Cuthbert also welcomed medical doctors. Indeed, his first post-mortem miracle was healing a paralyzed boy who asked if he might put on the saint's burial shoes. Both versions of this miracle say that the boy sought help at Lindisfarne because the community included extremely skillful physicians. A man of his times, for Cuthbert, supernatural therapy, religious practice, and ordinary medicine were all one continuum of healing options. In his afterlife, the outer text of Cuthbert's body in Durham is manifest, like the top of the SGP, in liturgical material. Victoria Tudor's work on the 12th century cult counts more healing miracles after 1170, perhaps in Durham's competition with Thomas Becket's new cult at Canterbury. 300 years later, Henry VIII's desecration squad was actually freaked out when they got to Durham and found Cuthbert's tightly wrapped body still pliable, resulting in them allowing him to remain on display for veneration in the church for at least a few years. Liturgical use also shaped the 19th century exhumations. That of 1828, that covers on the right here, was an effort against local Catholics to disprove tales invented for a superstitious age, says James Rainey. Rainey, who is the Durham librarian who published this most detailed and extremely confusing account, was reportedly seen trampling on the bones and pulling gilded silk vestments into shreds that he then handed out to his friends and acquaintances. The 1828 investigation also created the first large-scale public display of treasures and relics found in the tomb, which include a portable altar, pectoral cross, pocket gospel, seen on the left here, a comb and embroidered vestments, some of them were saved, all giving Cuthbert more liturgical meaning than the hundreds of associated human bones that are still buried with his corpse behind Durham's high altar today. You can still pray at his tomb in Durham and attend liturgy. But the essence of Cuthbert's personality remains, especially here at Lindisfarne, more that of an eco-saint, a powerful spirit on the wind and the waves. He attracts pilgrims of all religions to a dangerously tidal peninsula where, as historian Kate Tristram puts it, the sea must be allowed to have the last word. In conclusion, metaphor is, as Catherine Chin puts it, a reminder that our engagement with historical writing is always deeply physical. Metaphor is not historically useful simply because it is true. It is historically useful because it confronts us with unexpectedness and thus increases cognitive engagement with materials of the past. That's Chin. Sophronius, Theodore, and Cuthbert lived in a past known for active migration patterns, political disruptions, and religious shifts. In these social shifts, healing discourse connected the physical with community in migrant networks, kinetic public intersections of persons in motion, who Philip Winterhager has called in-betweens. Even the monk I began with, who finds healing in the Baptist cave just down the road, has moved and settled into a new place somewhat against his will. These stories remind us of the rich variety of social capital in such networks, as well as the risks and health factors that still shape refugee stories today, as border crossings continue to intersect with theology and culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was really, really interesting. I think we'll have time for some questions here, and I'll kind of moderate and ask some as we go on. If there's anything else people want to pop into the questions, please let me know. So first, we have one question that was specifically about the mysterious private collectors. And I think the person who asked this is probably interested in how these palimpsests that you talk about, how did they come together? What do we know about what standards were used and what's all these strange materials coming in to these manuscripts?
I hear two questions here. The private collectors and how they actually got put together.
Yeah.
So they got put together in the way that I described of the monks at wherever the original documents were being held needed writing material, and you can't run to your local Staples and get something. So they had, it's unclear because nobody actually wrote down, this is where I got the sources for rewriting this document. They either had books in their library that were old and decrepit and falling apart, so they scraped the ink off and reused those papers, or as Claudia Rapp suggests, perhaps there was some kind of market going on in those. How they actually then left the monasteries is a much larger mystery and controversy in many ways, because in many cases, we don't know how they actually got out into the world. The provenance is a constant challenge. Many of these seem to go back to Sinai, but the actual tracing, like the SGP seems to have a very clear line, but there is this couple of hundred years where we just don't know where it was. So it's a mystery, and the question of what should be allowed in private collections, that's a huge, huge debate. And there's a huge amount out there. And I think that Professor Crislip was probably much more qualified to comment on that than I am. But there's a lot of controversy, and much depends on provenance and who considers that they own it.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I had one question as I was listening to the different attitudes towards medicine between, say, Theodore and Cuthbert and Sophronius. It seemed like Sophronius, at least in his life, was evidencing a real competition between different types of healing in like the medical marketplace. Do you see any evidence from that in the British sources?
Can you say that again? Sophronius I get, but what about the British sources? Evidence?
It seemed to me that the British sources showed in Cuthbert and Theodore a much greater openness toward collaboration between what a modern person might say, oh, well, these are two different types of healing. Do you see anything like the Sophronius situation there, or why is that a difference between the Sophronian material and the others?
A lot of it is just the sources. Sophronius, we have this one document that clearly has an agenda to prove that the saints are the best source of medicine. And we also have his story, so it's clear why, and he comes to this midlife, so perhaps, and he obviously had used doctors in the past, so sees this competition. The Theodore and Hadrian texts and Cuthbert, the Theodore and Hadrian texts are, what we see are fragments. So unfortunately, it's a miracle that they have been actually able to say, yes, this is by Theodore, yes, this is by Hadrian. But all we see are fragments, and the purpose of those texts is not to prove a saint's ability to heal, but to exegete scripture or comment on something else. So I think the agenda is different. There's not a purpose for competition. In terms of the miracles of Cuthbert, it's interesting because Cuthbert's miracles shift over time. He clearly, there is this evidence that he had doctors at Lindisfarne, so people were coming to Lindisfarne for medical treatment. We don't know much more about that, which we assume is, whatever the folk medicine was at the time. Cuthbert does a few miracles during his life, but it's not a major part of his story. It's mostly what he had power over the natural world. And then he also, when you look at the lives, the miracles he does during his life are largely, a majority are done with women. Which is very interesting because he then, when he gets to Durham, there becomes this reputation that Cuthbert hates women. So the miracles more men get involved in the healing. So because healing is not a huge part of the text that we have about Cuthbert, there's no story that that there was a doctor who then had to kind of crawl in humiliation, admitting that he couldn't heal himself.
Thank you. So let me see more questions. Do you believe the historical significance of the palimpsests is their suggestion that migration could point to a sort of universal healthcare imperative?
I certainly think that early Christian writers assumed there was a universal healthcare imperative. I don't necessarily see that in these palimpsest texts, since they're simply writing how, Galen is simply talking about how to use medicine. But I think in the larger picture, the world that these texts existed within and the world of these writers, the world of medicine and Christianity in the 6th and 7th century certainly affirmed universal health care, certainly affirmed that Christians would believe that they should help anyone who needs health care. So yes.
I had a question as you were talking about trauma and migratory trauma. It's such a big issue right now. Do you see differences in the way trauma manifests and is described and is understood in these late ancient texts between the way trauma, this is a big question, but the way trauma now has become such a central focus of therapy and medicine? And I wonder how that plays out in this research.
That is a really, really interesting question. Yes, because when I looked at the modern refugee texts and the emphasis on how trauma affects refugees, there's so much stuff there that is not even alluded to in the ancient texts. And the ancient texts, you have to look for what, the fact that Theodore gets sick along the way, the fact that Sophronius has this eye disease. There's no sense that this is a travel thing, and they're doing these massive shifts, and there's no sense in the texts that they're noticing trauma, and much of the mental health issues that are our concern is not evident in these texts. I think back to the sermons on poverty that I've worked so much on in the Cappadocians, where they're talking about the homeless people who need help. And there's certainly a recognition, because gender and women and children were not part of my talk today, which I was very aware of. And that's why I emphasize these are privileged guys traveling, so perhaps they had very few traumatic experiences. But the Cappadocians responding to poverty and famine do recognize that there were, especially Macrina, bringing women into her community, that trauma happened. But I would say definitely we are more attuned to certain nuances of trauma than these ancient texts are in obvious ways. And I think this is a real place for further work. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. Are there any other questions that any of the attendees would like to post? So, would they have found the writing of Galen directly sacrilegious, or was his association with Asclepius considered controversial?
No, they would not have. Galen was a standard author who was used in Christian medicine. So 6th and 7th century, there was no controversy in the way when people were learning medicine to be doctors in what we think of as their sort of standard way. They were listening to lectures, they were learning how to practice on people with certain materials. They were using Galen and Hippocrates, and Stephen was a Christian. The Christian teachers were using a particular curriculum that was based on Galen and Hippocrates. So there was no explicit denial of Galen in that. Sophronius definitely poo-poos Galen and Hippocrates at least, but that's part of his focus on natural medicine is sort of not to be regarded compared to the saints.
Okay. One more question. Can you speak about Theodorus's knowledge of Greek medicine and its impact on Britain? The traditional story is that Greek medicine and philosophy, astronomy, etc., was largely lost by the 7th century, only to be recovered in the so-called 12th century Renaissance.
That is not my perception of the way things have been happened, because these texts were definitely, they exist. So this is a big question, whether Theodore, if there's this is part of what it all comes down to, really. I mean, if there's evidence that Theodore knew all this Greek medicine, then we know there were lots and lots of books in Canterbury. His school influenced many of the priests, and who then went on to work under Charlemagne. So he and Hadrian's school is a time of bringing much learning to the West. So it's entirely possible that, and we know that people were constantly going to Rome and bringing back lots and lots of books, including medical books. So it's very possible that many of these Greek texts were brought to England. The question is, how many people knew Greek? We know that Theodore and Hadrian taught Greek in their school, but most would have known Latin. So a lot of it is language. In the East, certainly the Greek texts continued, and they were not lost. They were translated. The Arabs translated them early, so it's a tracing. But yeah.
Right.
Thank you all for these wonderful questions.
Yes, great questions. And that seems like a good meaty question to end on here. So I think we can probably bring this lecture to a close. And I want to, again, thank Dr. Holman for joining us tonight and this really interesting lecture with fantastic palimpsests from Syria to England. Thank you to those of you who have showed up and attended. It was so nice to see smart questions from my former students in my ancient medicine class. So it was so nice to see you again. Again, we will have another Blake lecture next year. So please, in your own privacy of your own homes, please join me in thanking Dr. Holman for her lecture here, and have a great night. So thank you.